So, Jurassic Park. Have you ever seen it? Or them? What am I saying? If you're here, of course you have. It's one of the pillars of the dinosaur renaissance in the 90s. And what do I mean by that? Jurassic Park, along with The Land Before Time, are kind of the foundation of how an entire generation of paleontologists formed their fascination with dinosaurs in the 90s. And it's a coin toss on which one of these actually traumatized you as a child more. And then at the end of the decade, we got Walking with Dinosaurs, which for a long time was seen as one of the greatest paleo documentaries ever, and to many people it still remains to be true to this day. So I never want to diminish the cultural importance of any of these, because if it wasn't for them, I would probably not be talking to you right now. Hell, Jurassic Park was actually the first movie I ever saw in theaters. I was 5. So that probably explains a lot about me that's probably best discussed in therapy. But that's not why we're here. Today, we are going to discuss something that I have wanted to talk about for a long time on this channel. You see, as a 5-year-old little Steve in the early years of the dinosaur renaissance, I knew all of the famous dinosaurs. T-Rex, Triceratops, Stegosaurus, Brontosaurus. And because I was into this stuff, I even knew some of the level 2 obscurity ones like Ankylosaurus and Allosaurus. But as you can probably imagine, like for the rest of the world, May of 1993 was when I was introduced to 2 more carnivorous dinosaurs. Velociraptor and this. And if you have spent any amount of time enjoying paleo educational content here on YouTube, you have probably seen lots of people picking the former apart quite a bit. And I just want to say up front right now, I understand that the point of these movies is not to make something that's completely scientifically accurate. These are movies, not documentaries. And I do like at least most of these movies. What is even going on here? So some might argue that you should expect the same level of scientific accuracy from this as The Land Before Time. And that's fair, but I would say that by its very nature, people will take Steven Spielberg's science fiction film based on a novel by Michael Crichton much more seriously than what is basically Bambi in the Mesozoic era. I actually give the Jurassic Park Velociraptor a bit of a pass. Mostly because if you just change the name from Velociraptor to Deinonychus, which is the animal that was actually being depicted in the Jurassic Park films, it would still be a little bit too big, but it wouldn't be that bad. But they upscaled it because they wanted to make a scary movie monster. But this one? This is a whole different situation. Because this one actually bugs me even more than some of the newer, really dumb stuff. And since we are currently in the early Jurassic, I figured it was time to discuss this animal before moving forward. Because even though I normally like to say that my favorite theropod is Utahraptor, there are some days that I'm tempted to give this guy the credit. But I know that thanks to Jurassic Park, there is a chance that some people are gonna go,
one of those spitting lizards from Jurassic Park?
But the real animal is just so much cooler. And I wanted to make this video to give the real Dilophosaurus the flowers that it deserves. To start this off, let's get into the history of the discovery of this animal. In the summer of 1942, when Charles Lewis Camp led a team from the California Museum of Paleontology on an expedition to northern Arizona, word of these paleontologists looking for fossils spread among the Navajo Nation and eventually got to Jesse Williams. You see, he found this collection of bones about 2 years before in the rocks of the Kayenta Formation. So Camp and his team went to go check it out, and they ended up finding a nearly complete specimen and 2 other partial skeletons. None of these were 100% complete, but between the 3 they had a pretty full picture of what this animal looked like. They jacketed the more complete one and collected what they could from the others, and they were sent back to UCMP for study. On the good one, the pelvis was damaged and the front of the skull was crushed. But the front of the skull was intact in specimen number 2. So they looked at these 2 partial skulls and did the best that they could to reconstruct it. And the pelvis was put back together based on the pelvis of Allosaurus, since that was the theropod that we had the best pelvis of at the time. This was the best that they could do with what they had to work with. And although this was obviously a very significant find, because of the issues that the fossils had, it was hard to figure out exactly what it was. And a few years later, Samuel Wells, who was on Cape's original team who excavated the specimen, concluded that this was a new species of megalosaur. It was given the name Megalosaurus weatherilli, the species name honoring John Wetherill, a rancher and archaeologist whose close ties to the local people was instrumental in the discovery and excavation of these fossils. Now, I guess they assume that this was a Megalosaurus because it was an early Jurassic theropod, and at the time, Megalosaurus was kind of a wastebasket taxon, which basically means exactly what it sounds like. If they didn't know how to classify something and it was superficially similar, they would just throw it in there. Now, Wells would return to the Kayenta Formation nearly 20 years later, and there he would find another skeleton just 400 meters away from where the first three were found. Now, on this specimen, the skull wasn't exactly perfect, but it did have something that the other skulls did not have: a pair of two thin crests on top. This was something that Wells found very surprising. They, after all, did have Megalosaurus skulls to compare them to, and they never found anything like that on any of those. Or at that point, on the skulls of any other theropods that we knew of. This was so surprising that Wells basically described it as like finding wings on a worm. So he then went back and redid the study and got a closer look at the skulls of the other specimens, which we had 2 partial skulls out of the 3 specimens that were found. And in addition to concluding that those first 3 specimens were probably juveniles, under closer examination, he realized that the other good skull did have the base of 2 crests on top of the head. They had just eroded away. And after studying and comparing these specimens to several other European and North American theropods, Wells concluded that this was no megalosaur. This was an entirely new genus of meat-eating dinosaur. And he chose the name Dilophosaurus weatherilli, the genus name meaning Two Crested Lizard. Now, in the years since Dilophosaurus was first named, there was, as always, a lot of back and forth on what exactly this animal was like. And this may have actually been part of the reason behind some of the creative decisions that would eventually create the more famous version of this animal to the general public. When Samuel Wells was studying the original specimens, it was thought that Dilophosaurus had a rather weak jaw, and despite it being fairly large, especially for an early dinosaur, it would have struggled to be a predator of very large animals. So there were a few different theories that were being kicked around for decades, even after the 1964 specimen was found. The first one being that it was a devout scavenger, which, when I read that, I gotta say, didn't really make a lot of sense to me. And I don't know how that ever could have held water, because normally, one of the most common adaptations to being a scavenger is having a particularly strong bite. Think something like a hyena. This is because more than likely a scavenger is probably not going to have the choice of eating the easily consumed parts of a dead animal, because what they will be eating will probably already be partly consumed. So they have to do a lot more things like crushing bones in order to get the calories that they need. In fact, when some scientists were trying to push the idea that T-Rex was a strict scavenger, its massive bite force was something that they had tried to cite as proof for their argument. I think that with most animals, what people need to remember about this is, although opportunistic scavenging is common in nature, obligate scavenging is actually incredibly rare, especially among large animals. Going back to hyenas, they are famously thought of as scavengers, and they absolutely will scavenge, but they are also extremely effective pursuit predators, with large clans having around a 70% hunting success rate, making making them, on average, twice as effective as lions at hunting. So it's safe to say that Dilophosaurus was not a scavenger. It probably did scavenge, but it was not a viable way to make a living every single day. So the next thought was, well, maybe it ate fish. Maybe that little notch in the top jaw could help it catch the fish. Maybe its narrow skull allowed it to lunge its head into the water, similarly to things like egrets or other wading birds. I'll admit that this one does sound more plausible to me than the scavenger hypothesis. I can at least see where they were going with this one. But there are still a few issues. For one thing, if you look at the teeth of pretty much every reptile that is eating a lot of fish, whether it be crocodiles, plesiosaurs, rhamphorhynchoid pterosaurs, tanistrofeids, phytosaurs, or even other dinosaurs like spinosaurids, they all have very similar needle-like teeth that are good at gripping, and this is because fish are slippery. But if you look at the teeth of Dilophosaurus, they had flat blade-like teeth. These are teeth that are more similar to many of the well-known Mesozoic terrestrial predators. And what's more, the shape of the head, despite being narrow in cross-section, actually was not that well designed for reducing drag in the water. If you look at the Spinosaurids, which are the quintessential fish-eating dinosaurs, they have a snout that looks similar to a crocodile snout, while Dilophosaurus has big double crests on top of its head. With Spinosaurus, this would allow them to easily be able to move their head quickly from side to side in the water to grab something. So the fish hunter idea was thrown out. And so this is where I found an interesting theory come up. Because if it wasn't fishing or scavenging, and if it had a weak jaw, how was it able to hunt? And this is where the first talk of the possibility that this animal could have been venomous came up. The problem is, this is with absolutely no evidence to support it. It was just, well, it had to do something. Now, admittedly, things like this are very hard to prove or disprove when all you have to go on is fossils. But this wasn't based on a structure that they thought might have been a venom gland or anything. And as it turns out, this entire time we were actually wrong about Dilophosaurus having a weak bite. The first bit of evidence of this coming in the form of a skeleton of Ceratosaurus, which is a mid-sized sauropodomorph that lived alongside Dilophosaurus. And this skeleton had puncture marks in the bones, and these puncture marks were made by a large theropod. To this day, Dilophosaurus still remains the largest theropod found in the Kayenta Formation. But I can't help but think that some of the scientific back and forth about the nature of this animal may have inspired the idea for a certain author to include in his book, which in turn would inspire the unfortunate misinterpretation of this animal when it finally got its big break in Hollywood. And actually, hang on. I know this is gonna break the chronological order of the story, but I need to interject this here, because there's actually some brand new information that just got published while I was writing this, and it's actually very relevant to what we were just talking about. Based on a new study done by Evan Johnson Ransom on the feeding mechanics of theropods, where he reconstructed how the muscles attach to the skull as well as doing a finite element analysis, and tested the way that stress was distributed throughout the skull when carnivores bit down, actually showed something that was very applicable to this conversation. This shows that the crests of certain dinosaurs that had them, like Dracovenator and Dilophosaurus, may have actually helped them distribute stress along the skull whenever they were biting, and thus allowing these animals to bite even harder than previously thought. This proves that Dilophosaurus was actually capable of putting those bite marks that we found on the bones of Ceratosaurus, and was probably the apex predator of North America in the first half of the Jurassic. Alright, back to the 90s. This is the point in the story where 90% of people, especially the general public, first learned about this creature. Honestly, even if you didn't learn about Dilophosaurus from Jurassic Park, that's probably still true, because its DNA is in almost every depiction of this animal ever since. For example, the ones in Ark Survival Evolved are just uglier versions of the Jurassic Park design. And I know, nothing in those games is even remotely accurate. Honestly, the scaling of large dinosaurs in that game is the most broken thing ever. This isn't a dinosaur, this is a kaiju, but it's fun, whatever. But the thing is, even in this game, where everything is ridiculously massive, the Dilo is still this little creature with a frill that spits blinding venom. So these two completely separate franchises that have nothing to do with each other mess up Dilophosaurus in the exact same way. And that's honestly why I hate it, because this misconception has become popularized. And it has eclipsed the much cooler and more intimidating and more unique creature. More people know this than this. And when people see the same thing pop up in multiple unconnected places, they start assuming that this is the real thing. But the thing is, this animal honestly doesn't even make biological sense as an organism. And I feel I should explain. So, the Dilophosaurus in the Jurassic franchise has 3, but really 4 major differences that make it inaccurate. And I'm not counting the pronated wrists because that's an inaccuracy that all the Jurassic Park dinosaurs have. But the first and most glaring issue is the size. The largest specimen of Dilophosaurus was around 7 meters long, as opposed to this thing, which was maybe 2.5 meters? Maybe? Now, most of the dinosaur inaccuracies in these movies are for the purpose of making them scarier. And again, this is a movie, so I get it. But in the case of Dilophosaurus, I would argue that they actually did the opposite. Because, okay, look at this picture and tell me which one you find more intimidating. And if you need a better example, I would say read the novel. Because in the book, they actually depicted the Dilophosaurus closer to the correct size. I was actually going to read a portion of this book, specifically the death scene of Dennis Nedry, but it's bad. Like, I don't know if I could actually do that without YouTube banishing me for it. But just know that it is much, much, much more graphic and scarier in the book.
But Steve, didn't Nedry imply that the Dilophosaurus was a juvenile?
I thought you were one of your big brothers. You're not so bad. You're not so bad.
So, yeah, that is a possibility. Or at least it could have been a possibility when this line was written. However, since then, Dilophosaurus has shown up as a hologram in Jurassic World, as a taxidermied one in Fallen Kingdom, and there was like 3 or 4 of them in Dominion. And then briefly, another one showed up in Rebirth. And that's just the movies. So either all of these are juvenile Dilophosaurus, or this is as big as the Jurassic Park version gets. Now, I have also heard that this was an artistic choice on the part of the creators of the film. I don't want to say Spielberg because I want to believe that he's smarter than this, but apparently, according to some, the choice to make this animal smaller was to differentiate it from the other new dinosaur that was being rocketed into the spotlight by this movie, the raptors. Saying that if they had made Dilophosaurus the correct size, then people would not have been able to tell them apart. But the thing is, okay, first of all, just know, if they had made Dilophosaurus the size of the real animal, like in the book, it would have been twice the size of the Jurassic Park velociraptors. And this argument actually brings me to my next point, because the skull of Jurassic Park's Dilophosaurus is all wrong. When you look at the skeleton of this animal, the skull is kind of the main thing that stands out about it. It is its most unique feature. It is how it got its name. Like I described earlier, narrow skull, 2 head crests, that little nyet in the maxilla. It is a very unique dinosaur skull. But other than the head crests, none of this is here at all. If anything, the pointed yet kind of boxy skull of the Jurassic Park Dilophosaurus is kind of similar to a real Deinonychus skull. So apparently, in their attempt to make Dilophosaurus more distinct from the raptors, they actually made the animal closer to the real Deinonychus in both body size and skull shape. The Jurassic Park raptors are meant to be Deinonychus, but they actually fall in between that animal and Utahraptor in size. They're smaller than Utahraptor, but they're bigger than real Deinonychus. But the movie Dilophosaurus was actually a better scale representation of this animal. So here is where I take a step back and try to suspend my disbelief, because this is where I'm going to get into some speculative biology. Neither of these next 2 points were ever present in the real animal. As a science communicator, it is my job to tell you that. But I want to talk about how these adaptations work in reality, because these are the 2 features that this dinosaur, for better or for worse, are most famous for. I would argue that one of these traits makes sense for this organism to have, and the other one absolutely does not, at least in the way that it's shown to use it. So, first the frill, because I actually kind of like this aspect of this. That we know of, the only animal that has a similar arrangement to this is the frilled lizard from Australia and New Guinea. In this animal, it actually has skeletal elements that allow it to open and close its frill, and obviously we do not see any evidence of this in the real Dilophosaurus. But the reason why I somewhat like this is because I can see a reason why this version of this animal would have something like this. You see, the frilled lizard has this as a defensive adaptation. Whether it's against dingoes or humans today, or the large carnivores that used to live in the outback, the frilled lizard uses its neck frill to quickly appear larger as a way to temporarily shock whatever was threatening it, and then give it the opportunity to quickly run up a tree. Now, although the real Dilophosaurus would not need such an adaptation, in early Jurassic North America, like I said, biggest carnivore on the landscape. But if you shrink it down to 1/4 the size of the original and then put it on an island where it is the second smallest theropod in the area, second only to Compsognathus, I would say that a feature like this would actually be pretty favorable, because unlike its ancestors, it's no longer the top of the food chain. And that brings me to my final point, the venom. Now, the venom, or at least the application of said venom, is in this case most similar to what we see in different members of the elapid snakes, like cobras. Several species are able to spit their venom. Now, we can't say for sure whether or not there were any venomous dinosaurs. There have been theories throughout time. There was a point in time when we thought Siornithosaurus was venomous. From what I understand, that's no longer the case. But there have been theories at different times, and like I said, there was even a theory regarding Dilophosaurus. That's not actually where my problem is, though. My problem is that the way this animal uses its venom would not make sense as a way of procuring food. And you only need to look at the real-life inspiration to understand why. Many cobras spit venom, but they only do so as a form of self-defense. If a cobra sees a rat and wants to eat it, it does so the same way any other venomous snake does it. It bites. This is because venom and poison are not the same thing. Venom has to be injected or get into an unprotected part of the body, like the eyes or an open wound. Poison, on the other hand, can be absorbed through the mouth or skin. Let me put it to you like this. If it bites you and then you die, it was venomous. But if you bite it and then you die, it was poisonous. In the case of cobras or any other venomous animals that have ever lived, it would not make sense to spit its venom as a way of obtaining food. It makes sense as a defensive adaptation because more than likely an attacker would be facing the animal. leaving its eyes vulnerable. But as an attacking adaptation, this doesn't work. Most of the time, if you are hunting, your prey is either going to have its back turned or be running away, unless you're Newman. Now, I can accept that both of these are results of the DNA being incomplete and being filled in with the DNA of other animals. It's a major plot point after all, and this could be a great additional defensive adaptation. Just like the frill, this could be a way for this version of this animal to level the playing field alongside animals like raptors and T-Rex. My issue comes from both the movie and the novel saying and showing that this animal relies on this as an offensive adaptation for obtaining food. And that's when it stops making sense to me. This has just created a false understanding of what most people think this animal was really like. Because it has showed up now multiple times in multiple different franchises, people generally think that this is the real animal. So, I've talked about the discovery of this animal, how we struggled to figure out what it was really like, and how the misconception that was perpetuated by Hollywood has kind of muddied the waters for what most people understand this animal to be. Now, it's time for me to talk about the real thing, and why I think that this is the superior Dilophosaurus. Dilophosaurus really was the first king of the dinosaurs. It existed at a time when this clade of reptiles was coming up and filling every possible niche, especially that of large-bodied animals. At around 8 feet or 2.5 meters tall, 23 feet or 7 meters long, and around 880 to 1,000 pounds or 4 to 500 kilograms. It was the top predator in Western North America, or very likely all of North America. It still remains best represented in the Kayenta Formation, but trace fossils have been found all across the US that give us a hint that this carnivore was truly widespread. Now, many of these trace fossils are in the form of footprints, and footprints can be hard to diagnose exactly the species. This is obviously the track of a theropod, but beyond that, it's hard to say for sure, but these are all dated to the early Jurassic. And so far, Dilophosaurus still remains the only North American theropod from this time to reach this size. Until something else comes up, this is our best guess as to what animal made these footprints. And these tracks have been found from the southwest, where the skeletons were found, all the way up to the northeast, like New Jersey and Connecticut and Massachusetts. And we even have found some fossils suggesting that these animals may have been covered in, at least partly in feathers, in the form of resting impressions. There are actually a few, mostly from the northeast, showing spots where these animals may have sat or laid down in the coastal mud along the beach. Some have shown traces of striations, or imprints that look like they could have come from filaments. And then we have a butt print. Yes, really, we have what we think is a Dilophosaurus butt print. This is a section of ground where a theropod that only matches Dilophosaurus in size and age planted its feet, tail, and butt on the beach and sat. There was actually even an imprint of the cloaca in the ground. This fossil, which was found in Massachusetts, is one of a handful of examples that actually show dinosaur anatomy beyond that of skeletal. And we have some Dilophosaurus footprints that suggest that they may have either been social, living in groups, or at the very least that they were raising their young. Now, despite the trace fossils that are, like I said, all over the US, the Kayenta Formation still remains the best example we have of Dilophosaurus in a formation that gives us a really complete record of its food web. This formation dated to around 190 million years ago, covering an area that includes parts of Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. Today is mostly comprised of desert sandstone, but in the early Jurassic, These sediments were being deposited by slow-moving river systems, winding through a mix of sand dunes and conifer forests. In these rivers was a mix of bony fish and hybodont sharks, along with many of the amphibians that I mentioned in the last History of the Earth, like Eosicilia and many of the early frogs. Turtles like Cayanticheles, as well as lizards and several crocodiliomorphs, lived near the riverbanks, and there was a large number of synapsids, like Dinobitodon, Cayantotherium, and Oligocophus, as well as the true mammal Dinotherium. Getting into the other dinosaurs, we have the previously mentioned Ceratosaurus, which was a larger herbivore for the time, but still nothing compared to later sauropods. It was around 4.5 meters, or 14 feet long, and only around 450 pounds. So actually a pretty gracile animal. And another herbivore that lived in the formation was the tiny early thyreophoran Scutellosaurus. And there were even other carnivores here, like one late relative of Coelophysis, as well as Cayantovenator. But none of these other theropods came close to the size of Dilophosaurus. Now, with such a large variety of life, there was a lot of niches to be filled by multiple different types of carnivores. But there wasn't a ton of really large animals yet. The presence of things like cynodonts and coelophysid theropods shows that this was very much a moment in Earth's history in transition. Some of the last Triassic animals that were left were still hanging on, as many of what was coming up in the next chapter was just starting out. But even compared to all these other carnivores, Dilophosaurus was far and away the biggest and most powerful dinosaur seen here. This was not a scavenger or fish eater or a tiny venomous predator that would sneak around and spit venom to bring down its prey. This was the first top predator dinosaur, and honestly the blueprint of what we would see moving forward in the Mesozoic era. And if you would actually like to check out an animation that does a phenomenal job of depicting Dilophosaurus as well as all the other animals from the Kayenta Formation, I highly recommend checking out Hunted by Moonlight, part of the Dinosauria series by Dead Sound here on YouTube. It is currently the best animation of this time and place in Earth's history that I have ever seen. This has been a video that I have been meaning to do for honestly years. Like I said at the beginning, I give most of the Jurassic Park franchise dinosaurs a pass. For example, Jurassic Park 3's Spinosaurus. Because today, although we understand that this is pretty inaccurate, in 2001, when this movie came out, this actually wasn't bad. But this was never even close to accurate. 40 years before the first film came out, science knew that this was not even close to what the real animal was like. And unlike with all the other inaccuracies, which made for better movie monsters, this one I felt kind of got the short stick by comparison. So it was something that I felt like I really needed to put a spotlight on. I know, it has been talked about before, but this is one of my favorite dinosaurs, so I wanted my turn to talk about it. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and now with that out of the way, I think it's time to move forward again. Have a good one, everybody.